Hello. So we're moving right along, one more week of class, and I'm going to do a quick review of the last chapter before talking about some new frontiers and where the where photography went to in the 60s and into the 70s. So looking back at the atomic age, you have work that is changing how we are approaching and entering into abstract expressionism. The jazz age, with people like the artists like Barnett Newman, Jackson Pollock, Achille Gorky, William de Kooning, and Franz Klein, changing the way that we're approaching art. Which is affecting how we start thinking about photography with people like Minor White, who believes in this sort of underlying spirituality of the image, and that imagery is open to multiple interpretations depending on how the viewer approaches it. Which inspires people like Harry Callahan, whose early work is speaking about this isolation and loneliness of people on the streets. And the abstraction of it all. To Siskind, who starts off as part of the Photo League in New York, photographing Harlem, but moves into abstracting space and surface, as well as these free-floating characters in space. And The Family of Man, a very important pivotal moment in how photography is perceived, that is showing work of all different types about how we are all connected. And then to people like Robert Frank, who are showing, through a documentary snapshot aesthetic, the sort of underlying anxiety that's existing in the United States at this time that is sort of not being talked about. Okay. So then on to New Frontiers and how we read photographs. So the 60s brings us, Kennedy is elected, who's the youngest president at the time, who brought this new sense of vitality after the 50s, a new sense of youth, bringing new social programs, including the Peace Corps, the first Civil Rights Bill, and even a fitness bill. He has an aggressive foreign policy against communism, the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis. So still the Cold War is raging, as well as Vietnam is starting to ramp up, and he's assassinated, leaving the world with a gaping hole in 1964. And so here we end up at the beginnings of postmodernism. Robert Rauschenberg was a prominent member of the American post-war avant-garde, and the artist's sculpture painting hybrids, which are known as combines, they broke through the two-dimensionality of the canvas at a time when abstract expressionism dominated the scene. So he's using all different types. He's using traditional materials, such as paint and canvas, but combined with non-traditional materials such as found imagery, repetitive imagery, cyanotype, and collage, to create these new meanings. He began questioning the nature of painting through works such as Bed, here, and Monogram, which utilized commercial imagery of mass-produced objects. Many of his ideas, he foresaw the emergence of Andy Warhol. So he's kind of a pre-Andy Warhol. And here you see he's actually using the physical materials of a bed to create a painting that is a quilt. One of his most famous neo-Dada works is an erased de Kooning, where it consists William de Kooning, who was his friend. It consisted what he did was he bought a de Kooning and ritualistically erased all the drawing that he had purchased of the famed painter, He said, "I don't really trust ideas, especially good ones." He said, "I'd rather I put my trust in the materials that confront me because they put me in touch with the unknown." The birth of pop art. So, William Burroughs, who is attached to the beat writers of the time, but he was also a little older than them, and a little darker, known for his work Naked Lunch. That was this sort of surrealist work of writing, and so he's reimagining writing, and along with somebody named Brian Gysin, he comes up with the cut-up technique for poetry and words that relate back to Rauschenberg's Combines and the neo-Dada sense of using found material rather than created material.
Now, these experiments started not on tape recorders, but on paper. In 1959, Brian Gysin said that writing is 50 years behind painting, and applied the montage technique to words on a page. And this technique had already been used in painting at that time for 50 years. It was, in fact, kind of old hat in painting. Brian copied out phrases from newspapers and magazines, then took a scissors and cut these selections into pieces and rearranged the fragments at random. And these cut-up experiments appeared in Minutes to Go in 1959. When you experiment with cut-ups over a period of time, you find that some of the cut-ups and rearranged text seem to refer to future events. I cut up an article written by John Paul Getty and got, "It's a bad thing to sue your own father." This was a rearrangement and wasn't in the original text. And a year later, one of his sons did sue him. We had no explanation for this at the time, and just suggesting the press, when you cut into the present, the future leaks out. But we simply accepted it and continued the experiments. The next step was cut-ups on the tape recorder, and Brian was the first to take this obvious step. Now, here are some tapes which Brian made with all the technical facilities of the BBC in London, and they show, I think, what can be done with a human voice and one phrase.
All active calling all reactive agents.
Calling all active agents calling all active agents calling all active agents calling
all agents reactive.
Calling all reagents active.
All agents active. Calling all agents reactive. Calling all active agents. Calling all agents active. Calling reagents active. All. Calling reactive. All agents. Calling all reactive agents. Calling active. All reagents. Calling agents. All reactive. Agents active. Calling all reactive. Calling agents. All agents. Calling. Re-all calling active agents. Re-all active agents calling. Re-all agents active calling. Re-all calling active agents. Agents calling all reactive. Agents calling re-all active. Agents calling active all re. Agents calling all active re. Agents calling reactive all. Agents calling active re-all. Reactive agents all calling. Reactive agents all calling. Reactive calling agents all. Recalling all activations. Recalling active agents all. Recalling agents active all.
And so this is leading to pop art, and people like Andy Warhol, who are starting off as artists. Originally, Andy Warhol was an illustrator and a designer, and so something here like the Campbell Soup can, which was originally hand painted, but later he switched to these commercial methods of photo silk screening to produce serial versions so that they were reproducible and reference the can itself in the commercial world that it's coming out of. He also would take images of current events, politicians and celebrities that would usually incite a certain reference or emotion and try to completely decontextualize them or destroy them through an abundant and repetition and reconfigure the images, so it strips the original meaning and replaces it with a sense of a nullified capitalism. Like here, where we have Mao Zedong as almost a caricature that becomes less symbol of communism and more a cartoon. Marshall McLuhan, who is a writer and theorist, coins this phrase, the medium is the message, meaning that the form of a medium embeds itself in the message, creating a symbiotic relationship by which the medium influences how the message is perceived. The content of any medium is always another medium. Writing is speech, and the written word is print, and print the content of the telegraph, and on and on and on. A lesser-known photographer named Art Sensabaugh is working in, I guess he's in Midwest, but he's using what's called a banquet camera, which is this camera that actually pans on a motor to give a full panoramic view. And he's using it to create the sense of these vast empty spaces, giving it a somber mood. And this way of thinking begins to challenge this photographic code that has been laid out up until this point about how we're supposed to view things. We're also, at this point, the snapshot is in every home, and it's the way that we think and see our lives, thanks to Kodak, is now. This is part of the fabric of our lives. We think about snapshots, and the worlds that we live in, our moments in time, are no longer memories, but rather they're individual stories that are told for no audience. Which is leading to this vernacular of the snapshot aesthetic, which starts with people like Robert Frank, who is thinking more of what the image can do rather than the image itself. And moves on to people like Gary Winogrand, who was working on the street in the 60s using this snapshot aesthetic, but thanks to thinkers like Nathan Lyons and John Sharkovsky, who are these two sort of premier curators, we are now referring to this style of photography as what's called the social landscape, or social documentary, which is a reference to the filmmaking edict of cinema verite, in which constructs such a director relinquishes directorial control and pre-visualization in place for finding the happenstance of a scene. Winogrand had famously said, "I photograph to find out what something will look like photograph," which is an antithesis of Weston's notion of the pre-visualized image, going out and photographing these happenstantial moments. He would use a wide-angle lens, not because he wanted more of his subject, but because it forced him to get closer and more involved in the forces of the situation. That same wide angle would often lead him to sort of keep these tilted and chaotic frames as a way for him to both hide that distortion of the lens, but also give him a certain freedom to use that chaos and of the moment as a means of composition. We're often sort of falling out of the frame. Sometimes this casual approach infuriated his critics, who accused him of not being able to hold his camera. And here you can compare just how loose and wild those compositions are, as you're forced to find every detail, like the bus driver who is seemingly about to ram that car with the woman who is more concerned with the photographer, whose own shadow emerges in the corner in juxtaposition to Frank's image, a snapshot as well, that is, in comparison, looks rigid and formal. We quickly find the racial undertones, the sternness, and the sadness. And so there's a pretty, while we're sort of similar subject matter of looking into vehicles and buses, in Winogrand is much more chaotic, and the energy is much more in your face and less somber. Winogrand had a conviction that there was no special way a photograph should look, and it was this thinking that led to Sharkovsky, who's the curator at MoMA, who named in the opening of his book, The Photographer's Eye, that's Sharkovsky's famous book from 1966, the 5 elements to form a vocabulary and critical perspective for photography: the thing itself, the detail, the frame, time, and vantage point. A particularly dry and unsentimental approach without emotional attachment that would drive the course of popular fine art photography for over 30 years after that. Also, at the same time, there's this collective loss of innocence that's giving rise to a lot of new conspiracy theories, such as assassinations that are happening throughout the 60s and moon landings that are causing us to sort of give up those 50 ideals of the cookie cutter lifestyle. The first book about this subject is Bill Kaysing's self-published We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle, which was released in 1974, 2 years after the Apollo moon flights had ended. The Flat Earth Society was one of the first organizations to accuse NASA of faking the landings, arguing that they were staged by Hollywood with Walt Disney sponsorship, based on a script by Arthur Clarke and directed by Stanley Kubrick. And here Winogrand is having his own stab at that. Another person working on the street and sort of thinking about how this theater is happening is Lee Friedlander, who made a career out of working to present his private interpretations of public subjects, where he would push this narrative dialogue into a discussion of observation. He's working with an interior world that needed his camera to organize and make sense of it. So looking sort of at the self through that exterior world. He was notoriously sort of tight-lipped about, or is, he's still alive, tight-lipped about his work, but he said in the introduction to his first book, Self-Portraits, quote, "I suspect it is for one's self-interest that one looks at one's surroundings and oneself. This search is personally born and is indeed my reason and motive for making photographs. The camera is not merely a reflecting pool, and the photographs are not exactly the mirror on the wall that speaks with a twisted tongue. Witness is born and puzzles come together at the photographic moment, which is very simple and complete. The mind finger presses the release on the silly machine, and it stops time and holds what its jaws can encompass and what the light will stain." Many of his photographs employ these complex compositions that mix both order and chaos, and are often of these desolate streets, creating feelings of tension, peculiarity, and unease. Using again this sort of idea of the social landscape or social documentary style. And again, this is another quote from him, is the idea that the snapshot would be thought of as a cult or movement is very tiresome to me, and I'm sure confusing to others. It's a swell word, I've always liked it. It probably came about because it describes a basic fact of photography. In a snap, or a small portion of time, all that the camera can consume in breadth and bite and light is rendered in astonishing detail, all the leaves on the tree as well as the tree itself and all its surrounding. He would often employing kind of this humor on these happenstantial moments in the street, and he's trying to give order to this fragmented chaos, not to define society per se, but rather to find his own place within that structure. And he sort of forces viewers to search for that lone human presence in the pictures, which may be his own shadow. But as a viewer, it could be anyone's shadow. Sometimes shy and lonely, sometimes stalking and antagonistic, sometimes alone with no one else around, but left to observe the scene alone in a sort of meditation. And another part of this group, you can see this photo, is by Gary Winogrand, of Diane Arbus. And she is very famous and known for her images of people that, when we were discussing her work, are often referred to as freaks or on the fringes of society. And so while that's not sort of the PC word that I like to use, it does come up a lot in talking about her work. And so it's important to sort of preface this all, is that while she did photograph a lot of people who are often the unseen, she also had a propensity for giving a subject a new subversive meaning, such as in this picture with the child with the Tor grenade, which is perhaps her most famous image, where you have this psychotic child who's about to blow everything up. And keep in mind, this is during the Vietnam War, so there's a lot of sort of references to anti-war sort of buried deep in her pictures. But when you look at her contact sheet, we can see just how powerful editing and curation of one's work can be. Where here's this entire contact sheet, and this child who she photographed is kind of this sweet-looking tow-headed boy who gave Arbus this one playful moment, that right there, and I think it's the first frame, of where it's this kind of this playful madness, but she then chooses to curate it and show this sort of horrifyingness of what this world has done to this child. And this type of curation goes back to one of her teachers, Lisette Model, who said, "The most mysterious thing is a fact clearly stated." And here we really see the power of that influence of Lisette Model, who is also not looking for for acceptable moments, but those in-between areas that are rarely looked at, complete with the chain of human existence. Often using a direct flash and a 2 1/4 square frame, Arbus's work takes on a confrontational style that often depicts people willing to shed their skin to reveal an underlying persona. And willing is maybe a stretch. Maybe she takes it. But here you have, this crying child where we're confronted with that, those tears. Or even in here, who's just this woman and that severity in her face because of how Arbus is portraying her. Her work was often seen sensational because she wasn't afraid to confront taboos, such as a biracial couple, which was a big deal in the 60s, or this young teenage couple who looked like children. She, without affect, would picture people on the margins of society, so that these images were not about the person as individuals, but rather about the archetypes of these human circumstances. And it was after her suicide that her work developed a cult following, though she still maintained her critics, like Ellen Sekula, who called her work fetishistic cultivation of freaks and had cruelly sacrificed humanity. However, her counterpoint to that was her own interpretation that was derived from a Goethe quote, that every form seen correctly is beautiful. Often she was able to befriend her subjects, such as Eddie Carmel, who was known as a Jewish giant, who she photographed for years before finally making this image, which is the one that she liked. And sometimes her work, the idea of what a freak is flipped on its head to portray the discomfort and anxieties of being normal as well. As well, as I mentioned before, her political beliefs bleed into these, which has a slightly more direct approach to criticizing than Frank's poetic version, where she's now portraying this pro-war teenager as other or different. Well, Frank has a sort of poetics to what he's doing. And her very last body of work, which is very controversial, is where she photographed people with mental handicaps. And while these pictures were never presented with explanation, and therefore get criticized for taking this idea of freak too far, and bringing it to people who don't have a voice in how they're depicted, they can also be viewed as not being about type or disability or difference, but instead the communal secret of wanting to find an idea of normal and a yearning to accept people as they are. So new journalism, which is sort of coming out with people like Hunter S. Thompson, who is writing these books, Truman Capote, Tom Wolfe, Norman Mailer. All of these books are based on true events, but they're written as novels. And it's a style of news writing and journalism that was developed in the 60s and 70s, which use these unconventional techniques that had subjective perspective, that emphasized truth over facts, where they would immerse themselves in the stories so they become part of the stories, which lends itself to photography very nicely. So Bruce Davidson is one of these photographers who's kind of not like the life photographers, but he's making photo essays that are about perseverance and holding on to dreams. This circus series is where he photographed at least 3 circuses from 1958, which focuses on this a circus dwarf named Jimmy Armstrong, which is a sympathetic and sad look at these real working people rather than depicting them as freaks, where he's trying to find the dignity in the midst of tribulation and endurance in a hostile world. He would go on to photograph this Brooklyn Gangs, where he's photographing these teenagers in Brooklyn and really becoming part of their community and showing the hardships that these teenagers are going through. And he said, "I took the finished photograph to the editors of Life, who looked at them and gave them back to me. I became more aware of the photographs of Robert Frank, who had just published The Americans. In it, I saw an America that diminished the dream and replaced it with a piercing truth. It was hard for me to endure those bitter, beautiful photographs, for I had still within me the dream of hope and sympathy." One of his best-known works is called East 100th Street, where he, for over a year, just photographed this one block in Spanish Harlem, and really became part of or was ingratiated to these people. And this long-form essay where he's photographing this community and getting to know the people. So we get to know characters. We get to go inside their house and learn more about who they are, rather than just have a subjective essay that is boom, boom, and done. And somebody else who starts to do this is Danny Lyon, who actually gets to start as a student at the University of Chicago, and I have mentioned this before, but sort of got a lot of attention 4 years ago when this photograph of Bernie Sanders emerged at a sit-in, and people were arguing if it was Bernie Sanders or not, and then Danny Lyon said, yes, it is Bernie Sanders because I was there, and that's my photograph. So he starts off with this idea of that he's really, there's very sort of high political ideas, looking at racism, looking at the politics of the time, and he moves on. And he's also, one thing he's really interested in is bike riding and actually cafe racing, which is this type of sort of small motorcycle racing in the mud. But that led him to this study of the Outlaw Motorcycle Club, which is a sect of the Hells Angels, and his first monograph called The Bike Riders in 1968, where he did more than just photograph this gang in the Midwest, but he actually became a member of the Chicago Outlaws, or he became a pledge, and he traveled with them, sharing their lifestyle and really getting involved with them. And according to Lyon himself, these photographs were an attempt to record and glorify this life of the American bike rider. And actually this book, in the end, what he does in it is he actually includes, I think, over 40 pages of interviews with these guys, so you really get to know the personality of who these people are. His next body of work was called Conversations with the Dead, where he tried with what he said, I tried with whatever power I had to make a picture of imprisonment as distressing as I knew it to be in reality. And so he got access into a prison, and I always find this a great juxtaposition, because in these we're less involved with the people. We don't have the same access that he had in the bike riders, but so he's using sort of form and really falling in more to how their jumpsuits look and how they play against the landscape, and creating that almost it's a critique of that through how he's composing his images. The last thing I have here that I'm not going to show you right now, I'm going to include it in the email, is it's a half-hour-long documentary about Diane Arbus that I will send to you, and I would like you to watch it because I think it's pretty informative about her process and in her own words. So that is it for this one, a sort of short one, and I'm going to actually give you another one today as well, and I'll send you an email and we'll talk soon. All right.